The New York Rangers adjust to their new coach. The Montreal Canadiens deal with some early season injuries, and the Vancouver Canucks look to build on a surprisingly good start. We've got all that and more on today's Locked On NHL podcast.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome, everybody, to the Monday edition of the Locked On NHL podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I want to thank everyone who makes Locked On NHL your first listen every day. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you can get new episodes as soon as they drop. And you can find us now on SiriusXM on the SXM app. Just do a search for Locked On NHL. Today's episode is brought to you by Sleeper. Download the Sleeper app and use promo code LOCKEDONNHL. You can get up to a $100 match on your first deposit. Terms and conditions apply. See Sleeper's terms of use for details. It is great to welcome back to the show the host of Locked On New York Rangers, John Chik. And John, let's start with the big guns first. I know it's a small sample size. We're early in the season, but what's going on with Igor Shesterkin so far?
You know, I think in the most recent game, or second most recent game now against the Predators, he just didn't have his A game. But honestly, you could say the same thing for the entire team. Through 3 games of this season, I don't think anything was necessarily perfect for the Rangers. Obviously, they got a new coach, learning a new system, the whole 9 yards. And, you know, not everything firing on all cylinders, but finding a way to get it done, finding a way to win. And in the game against the Predators, I mean, for one reason or another, they just could not get out of first gear. They were kind of outworked the entire night. I know the Predators themselves were coming off of a pretty embarrassing 6-1 loss to the Oilers. So maybe that was kind of their gut check game and the Rangers just weren't ready for that. I'm not really sure what the reason was, but Igor was one of many, many players on that night that did not have his A game. I thought Igor, though, in the game against the Coyotes was absolutely fantastic. And, you know, some people might hear that and say, oh, it's the Coyotes. The Coyotes look better to me in that game than I've seen them look in a long time. I know they beat the Devils right before that, and I think they beat the Blues right after that. So that game was an absolute battle, and Igor was fantastic in that game. He looked like vintage Igor Shesterkin. There was a long 3-on-2. In fact, I think it was a full 2 minutes of a 5-on-3, where, you know, the Rangers successfully killed it off against the Coyotes, and Igor made some fantastic saves there. And, you know, overall, like I said, his goals against average probably isn't good right now because he's had 2 games where he gave up a decent amount of goals, but he's not somebody I worry about at all. I think overall he has played well this season. Like I said, nobody had it against the Predators, so I'll just kind of put that in the category of, you know, burn the tape and move on. So, yeah, no worries about Igor thus far.
All right. On Saturday, a win in Seattle over the Kraken. Obviously, you know, those West Coast road swings are a little tricky, but kind of strange goings on with the lights kind of partially going out, and yet the Rangers get it done in the dark.
Yeah, kind of a strange situation there. I mean, that's kind of a newer arena, right? You know, you would think that of all the arenas to have the lights go off, that would probably be the last one. Yeah, just one of those things that can happen during the course of a hockey game. And, you know, overall, I think the Rangers played well in that game. Obviously, Artemi Panarin scores twice. And I feel like something he's doing more this season is something that I've talked about on my podcast. And certainly I'm not the only Ranger fan that feels this way, but just wanting him to shoot more. You know, he's such a great passer. And he's so selfless, and he's just such a likable guy. And I have no doubt that Panarin would rather set up his teammates to score than score himself. But, hey, sometimes you got to be a little bit selfish. An example I always use when it comes to that is a couple of years ago, Game 7 overtime against the Penguins. I'll bring this up on the podcast every now and then. I'm kind of joking, but I'm kind of serious. Like, I'm glad he decided to be selfish in that moment there, because if he doesn't shoot, he tries to force a pass somewhere. Who knows what happens in that game? But I also kind of get the feeling that could be the coaching staff. That could be Laviolette telling him, hey, we want you to shoot the puck a little bit more. Yeah, he's a great passer. He's a great shooter too. So sometimes instead of trying to force that pass through a bunch of traffic, just shoot the puck. And obviously it worked out for him last night.
You mentioned Laviolette, obviously the coaching change. What do you see, both good and bad, so far in the new regime and how they're going about things?
Yeah, I think with Laviolette, he's somebody that's a little bit more hands-on than Gerard Gallant was. And let me say, I'm not one of those Ranger fans that like was totally against Gallant from the second he got here. I'll always be appreciative of, you know, him turning this team around, getting them pointed in the right direction. That run to the Eastern Conference Final when everybody thought they were still rebuilding one of the most fun seasons I've ever had as a fan of this team. But obviously they made the change. And Laviolette, overall, I think the thing that a lot of Ranger fans are going to get on board with Laviolette is the fact that he's basically kind of turned the kids loose this season. With Gallant, they would sporadically appear in the top 6, but then, he'd kind of run out of faith in them and he'd rather go with a veteran there and they'd drop back down. And you could somewhat understand that sometimes when the three of them play together. I'm talking about Kakko, Lafreniere, and Hedl. The three of them play very well together. But by that same token, eventually you got to take the training wheels off a little bit. I think Laviolette has done that. And all three of those guys played great in this game last night. They've been a little bit up and down to start the season, but you got Hedl and Lafreniere both playing with Panarin. Naturally, their numbers are going to improve. We've seen multiple examples of that. Anybody that plays with Panarin, their numbers are going to go up. And Kakko had some success in limited time with Mika and Kreider last season. I think that's going to continue this season as well. He had a nice game last night too.
Again, we're early in the season, just in the second week, but what do you like the most about what you've seen from this team this year so far?
It's a good question. I would say that it's just the fact that there's going to be a lot of accountability, and it's the fact that they seem a little bit more structured this season. One example I can use of that was opening night against Buffalo. They basically suffocated them, and Buffalo is kind of a team that's up and coming, and they got a few more scoring threats now than they used to. They were kind of going with this 1-3-1, almost like a modern day trap, so to speak. And there were times where, Buffalo, they would have the puck in their own zone, and the Rangers would be kind of sitting back in the neutral zone, and they just had no idea how to attack it. They didn't know whether to try to skate through everybody, get the red line and dump it, try to, start a rush up the ice. They just had no answers for it. And I think you saw some of that in the game against Seattle last night as well. Jonathan Quick, he played very well. But obviously the Rangers defended very well in that game additionally. So overall, again, the only game that really just kind of was rough was the game against the Predators. I would say 4 out of 5 of the games they've played so far, they played pretty well. I know some people might look at the 5-3 loss to Columbus, but if you watch that game, the Rangers had the better play in that game. It's one of those nights where the puck just would not go in the net and just didn't get any favorable bounces. But overall, through 5 games, hasn't been perfect, but I think I'm feeling pretty good, and I think a lot of Ranger fans would probably agree.
And what do you think needs to be worked on the most after the first 5 games?
Yeah, I would say, again, it's 5 games. It's hard to, always know for sure, what's kind of a fluke and what could be a developing trend. There were a couple of times, though, where I feel like they've taken some penalties that they don't really need to take. Look, if somebody's going toward your net and they've got a great chance and you hook them, you can understand that. But when you're trying to lift somebody's stick in the offensive zone and you whack them in the head with it, it's, you get a high sticking penalty. It's like, come on, man, you can't be doing that. So that, maybe a little bit more disciplined and really, really slow start. Like I said, against Nashville, that was really their one bad game. And that was something that happened a little bit too frequently last season. And again, it's too early to know if that was just a fluke against the Preds. 82 games, it's going to happen once in a while, but we just don't want it to become a habit. So that's something to keep an eye on going forward. That's something the Rangers have to correct from last season, just getting off to better starts in games.
And after 5 games, what is the biggest surprise to you that you've seen from this team?
Biggest surprise? I would say just probably the overall team defense has been very good. I think they've mostly supported Igor Shesterkin. To go to an individual player here, I will say Erik Gustafsson. Obviously, the Rangers in free agency, they had precious little cap space to work with. They signed 10 or 11 free agents the first couple of days. Some of them are in the minors, obviously. But they didn't sign anybody for more than $900K. Nobody had more than 6 figures. So you got to kind of go discount shopping. And Erik Gustafsson has stepped in there. The one night Lindgren was out of the lineup, so Gustafsson played with Adam Fox. He looked great there. He's somebody that they've gone to on the power play a little bit. And for somebody that kind of has a rep as an offensive defense, and I've been impressed by some of the defensive plays that he's made as well. So overall, I think that's a pretty nice pickup for the Rangers. And again, we don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves. It's early in the season here. But as far as free agents go around the league, show me another guy making 6 figures this year on a new team that has gotten off to a better start than Erik Gustafsson. I'm not so sure that player is out there anywhere.
Not so sure either. All right, John, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you on social media?
Yes, so anywhere you're listening to or watching this podcast, obviously we're on YouTube now. You can check us out there. Any audio streaming platform, you can find Locked On Rangers there as well. You can follow me on Twitter at jchik17 and also the podcast at _NY_Rainers, also on Twitter. So yeah, we're not hard to find. Like I said, anywhere you're watching or listening to this, you can find us there as well.
All right, John, thanks so much. Always a pleasure.
All right. Thanks for having me, Gil.
Your favorite player scores a hat trick. Your favorite team wins the Stanley Cup. And if you want to win 100 times your money, play daily fantasy hockey on the Sleeper app. These are all possible scenarios for this season. But to have a chance at winning big, you need to play daily fantasy hockey on Sleeper. As the official daily fantasy app of Locked On NHL, Sleeper is our top choice for daily fantasy sports, especially daily fantasy hockey. With Sleeper, you can win 100 times your cash in daily fantasy hockey contests. With studs like Connor McDavid, Alexander Ovechkin, Sidney Crosby, Cale Makar, all you need to do is pick more or less on stats for these stars or any player. Just choose stats like goals, assists, saves, plus minus, and more. You heard me, hockey fans. 100 times payouts on Sleeper, so start paying attention and get your picks right so you can win big. Use the promo code LOCKEDONNHL and you'll get up to a $100 match on your first deposit. Terms and conditions apply. That's Locked On NHL. See Sleeper's terms of use for details. It is my pleasure to welcome back to the show the co-host of Locked On Canadiens, Laura Saba. And Laura, the Habs are off to a pretty good start, 2-1-1 through 4 games. What's been the biggest reason for this solid start?
I'm going to be really honest. We've been trying to pinpoint it, and it feels like some of the things that went wrong last year are still going wrong. For example, the injury bug. Still, the Canadians are still extremely unlucky with injuries, and I know we're going to get into that in a second. Their special teams are also not that great, but it feels like a couple of the players that are on the roster kind of finding themselves. Somebody like Alex Newhook has turned out to be a positive addition to the team. Uri Slavkovsky has taken a step forward. There are still some issues that the Canadians are having overall that are the same as last year, but there is a little bit better commitment and willingness to the finer details of the game that I'm finding overall throughout the lineup that are showing the Canadians that are the reason for the Canadians' better start.
And, you mentioned the addition, for example, of Newhook. Who are some of the younger players maybe who have stepped up their game a little bit?
I think they're the expected players. I do want to mention or highlight Raphael Harvey Pinard. He's still keeping himself in that conversation. What we're seeing from Jesse Ylönen, for example, as well, the younger players seem to be quite determined to show what they've got, and it's going really well. And the big thing is that behind them in Laval, there are a lot of players that are already making their mark, that should we have any issues with terms of injury or anything like that, they will be, the help is not too far away, I should say. And also Josh Anderson for the last couple of games, obviously, he is kind of streaky where he has hot periods and cooling off periods. It also very much depends on who they play him with, but he's had a good few games, I would say. And I think from the defense, Matheson and Kovacevic have been very steady. And that has really, really steadied the rest of it. And again, the Canadiens defense is not, it's not all stellar, all world or anything like that. But I think, like I said, it's the finer details that they're playing really well at that's really helping them. And their 5-on-5 game is so important because their special teams are not good, but their 5-on-5 game, their even strength game has improved so much in the first 4 games when you compare them to last year.
Always good. Hopefully you spend most of the game 5-on-5. You mentioned injuries. Kirby Dach again, not
Huge
playing
loss.
in all. What was that?
Huge loss.
Yeah. Missing 2 games already. Talk to me about what his loss means and what his outlook is.
So in the first game, that line, the Kirby Dach line, he had, I believe, Newhook and Slavkovsky on that line. I'm now forgetting. It feels like a year ago. That line was so good that people thought, okay, they might be challenging for the top line. And then in the second game, he left at some point with a quote unquote lower body injury. It was announced he would not return. A day and a half later, it was announced that it was an MCL or an ACL, and he's going to be out for the entire season, which is not great because he last year was the revelation of the Habs. He was he solidified Kent Hughes' trust in him. And the thing is, like, he's had injury issues, but as was pointed out on our show, it's bad luck. It's freak injuries and bad luck that have been plaguing him. He's not an injury prone person. It's not like he's not durable, but like it's literally freak situations that anybody would get injured in. So that's been a big loss, but it also obviously opens up opportunities. And the other thing too is that the Canadiens are also seeing injuries throughout the junior teams as well as the AHL. There are some problems right now, but I'm really, really hoping that they're not as dire as the Kirby Dach situation.
So you mentioned opportunities. Who will get the chance to step up and try to replace some of the production that Doc would have provided?
So in terms of like the center role, they've moved Alex Newhook there for the moment. The possibility of Sean Monahan, who again is not a younger player, making it, taking charge of that line as well, if ever necessary, if ever shuffling is needed, is there. But in terms of offensive production, Joshua Roy is really, really making a mark. He's playing really well with Sean Farrell in the AHL on the Rocket. So if there's ever a call up to be made at forward, it's going to be Joshua Roy. He's really not just put himself in the conversation, he's run away with the conversation. Like, he has played so well through 4 games that it is incredible. And like there's no one other than Joshua Roy. And the prediction is that if he does get called up, it will be for a long stint. It's not going to be 1 game or 2. He's going to get called up and might never see the AHL again.
All right. And as far as on the NHL roster, what moves do you think? Because they'll probably try that first, I would think.
Well, Christian Dvorak is coming back relatively shortly. We're almost in November. So that's going to be, I think, the big question mark, how he returns, how he plays, whether there's a market for him. But if not, for the first few games or for a little while, I think that's who the experiment is going to be once he returns. And then if he gets traded away or if he doesn't look like he used to, then other questions will be asked.
So, I mean, obviously the Canadiens right now still in a rebuilding kind of a mode. What are the keys to this being a successful season, you feel, now that we're 4 games in?
Well, I'm gonna come right out and say it. I do think the Canadiens are gonna finish last in the division again, just because of everybody else who's in the division, right? Like, everyone else just has a better roster right now, and the Canadiens are still in a rebuild. I'm not gonna be too disappointed as long as they don't squander whatever draft pick they get at the end of the year. But what I'm looking for this year is I'm looking for overall improvement in the strategy of the game and for each player to be taking a step forward. What we saw last year was a lot of players, whenever they gained momentum, they would get injured. Slavkovsky was one of them. Caden Gooley was another one of them. Now we're seeing the same thing. Like Kirby Dach took that step forward, but he got injured this year, right? Like, what I want to see is the Canadiens overall trade away some of that dead weight on the cap space, and also try and stockpile picks or prospects that are going to be used in the longer term, not in the next couple of years. And I want to see improvements on every front, particularly with the defensive strategy and the way the Canadiens play defense overall. We know, like, there are players that are being called upon to do more than what is their talent, really, because of lack of options. But there are players in the pipeline that will be coming up. I just want to see better habits. I want to see better strategy on the special teams. I want to see each player take a step forward as opposed to a step back. And Juraj Slavkovsky is going to be a big one on that.
How confident are you that management will use those draft picks, accumulate them, and then, get good value out of them?
I think they're doing a good job of getting good value back, but I have some questions about how they're using the picks that they get. And obviously, I think, last year was such a great year for them in the draft. This year was a little bit disappointing in terms of what the what Canadians fans wanted. So I think right now that section is hit or miss, but getting good value in a trade is not something that I'm worried about with respect to Kent Hughes.
All right, Laura, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you and your co-host on social media?
So my co-host and I are all over social media. Our podcast is Locked On Canadians, and you can find that wherever you get your podcast, as well as on YouTube, just like this podcast. You'll find us on Twitter at LO_Canadians. Individually, you'll find me at The Active Stick, and you'll find Scott at Scott Matla, and he covers the Rocket as well.
All right, Laura, always a pleasure. Thanks so much for stopping by.
Of course. Thank you so much, Gil.
Today's episode is brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. What brings home the winning trophy is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. From superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. And with over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home that win. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. It is my pleasure to welcome back to the show the co-host of Locked On Canucks, Trevor Beggs. And Trevor, nice start for the Canucks to this season. A couple of big wins over the Oilers early, and the offense seems to be clicking. What's been the key to this surprisingly good start?
Well, I think first and foremost, it starts with the goaltending. Every game so far, the goaltenders have given the team a chance to win. I mean, the Canucks definitely did their part to help Thatcher Demko in the first game, where he was sharp, but only had to make 21 saves when he was under the weather and threw up in his mask during the game. So the Canucks helped him out there. But in the last 4 games, DeSmith has had 2 of those starts. Demko has also had 2 of those starts. And every game, the goaltender has, been a story for the Canucks, giving the team a chance to win the game. The offense clicking for sure. That is a story. But I think first and foremost, the goaltenders deserve credit because the Canucks' Achilles heel, surprise, surprise, is still playing defense. Now, Hronek's look good, Hughes look good, but behind that, it's a little dicey. But at the end of the day, they've had the goaltending, and between Pettersson, Miller, and Boeser, those guys are all up there in terms of league leaders in scoring. They've been able to outscore some of their problems.
Yeah, and you mentioned the goaltending. Similar statistics for Demko and DeSmith: a .930 save percentage for Demko, a .926 for DeSmith. How has DeSmith fit in with this team so far?
Yeah, I'd say so far so good, and there's some familiarity. There's been a few ex-Penguins that have come over to the Canucks, so he's certainly didn't come to this team not knowing anybody. But I think it started in preseason, right? Spencer Martin waived, and it was clearly going to be DeSmith and Demko. And DeSmith was really sharp in his first preseason start. And then in that second game against the Oilers on the back-to-back, DeSmith got the start after the Canucks 8-1 romp of the Oilers. And you knew the Oilers were going to come out flying that game, and they scored in the first minute. But, the Canucks, they were able to eke it out. And a lot of that was DeSmith. I think the shots were, 41-16 in that game? So DeSmith had to make a number of really good saves, stood on his head. I don't know if he was as big a story against the Panthers, but he was sharp. And then, the team kind of collapsed in front of him. Panthers tied up 3-3. Canucks find a way to win. But the point is that the goalies have given the Canucks a chance to win in every game. And both DeSmith and Demko deserve credit for that.
Got to talk a little Brock Boeser. I mean, what is it? 6 goals in 5 games. Not a bad start to the season. What's he doing so well?
You know what? He looks a step quicker and he looks a step more dialed in. I think it's been well reported over the past couple of years. He was dealing with obviously his father being in ill health and then passing away. Trade rumors as well. There was a lot going on for Brock Boeser over the past couple of years. And he talked about over the summer, he switched trainers. He was more dialed in, and he kind of looks a step quicker. Just, it looks more like the player who he was as a rookie, aside from the guy who, kind of tailed off for the last couple of years. So it's funny. It's always funny how things work. I was very critical of Miller and Boeser as a pairing last season. I think defensively, they weren't able to outscore their defensive issues. And this season, it's been exactly the opposite. I think Miller looks completely dialed in. I think that those two as a duo work well together. Phil DiGiuseppe is maybe the unsung hero on the Canucks. He's found his way into the top 6 there on that line. And that line is working, and it's arguably been the best line for the Canucks so far.
Talk to me a little bit about Quinn Hughes. He leads the team with a +6, plus-minus, 5 points in 5 games. What is he doing so well?
Quinn Hughes, this has got to be the year that Quinn Hughes gets some Norris love. I do feel like this guy is probably a bit disrespected around the NHL. Like, people just think he's small and can only play offense. He's all over the ice. I mean, I think the big difference in his game so far this year is he's shooting the puck more. And he said that in preseason that he wanted to shoot more. Let a good shot go on the power play against the Florida Panthers the other night that went in. But he just looks absolutely dialed in. I mean, Quinn Hughes always looked amazing. And he's out there blocking shots. He's out there breaking up plays in the defensive zone. I mean, I hope this is the year that Quinn Hughes kind of gets his love. And I think for him to truly get that love, the Canucks got to go on a bit of a playoff run. It can't just be regular season success. But man, oh man, Quinn Hughes and also Elias Pettersson, like, these two look like they're ready to be two of the best players in the league this season.
With Hughes, do you think it's a little bit of a confidence thing that he's now just really comfortable and confident in what he can do in both ends of the ice?
Yeah, it might be a bit of confidence, but Hughes had an interesting quote kind of early on this season, and it might make some people laugh, but he basically said that we're getting older, and talking about the core in terms of himself and Pettersson and Miller and Demko, and Hughes is what, I think he's 24 years old right now, so it's not quite an old man, not quite a graybeard, but Quinn Hughes kind of made it evident in that interview, in that quote, that he thinks it's time for this team. It's time for the Canucks to start winning. And I think most fans would agree. It's been a lot of losing in this market for the last 10 years. So I think Quinn Hughes, like many on this team, is sick of losing. And I think that's part of the reason that they're taking his game to another level. I mean, the start matters so much for Vancouver this season. I know it's important for every team to start strong, but especially the Canucks, the way the last couple of seasons have gone, the last 3 seasons in particular, have been, putrid starts that have basically sunk their season early on. So for them to start strong was huge. And Quinn Hughes really looks like he's taking that to heart.
So you talk about a strong start. You talk about a team that's sick of losing. What are the keys for this team to return to the playoffs this year?
I think it's twofold. I would say it's, their strengths got to continue to be strengths, and their strengths are, above average goaltending and a potent offense and a potent power play. But they do have to shore up their issues to an extent as well, Gil, and that is defending. I think the Canucks have now been outshot in 4 of their 5 games, or the last 4 games, I guess, since the beginning of the season. So the defense is still kind of messy. The penalty kill has looked better, but it's got to be at least league average, and they're kind of on the right track right now. They got burned by a couple of good power plays, and Kucherov had a couple power play goals against them. They played Edmonton twice. So some of the games haven't been easy in terms of defending power plays, but the penalty kill looks better, but it can't be dead last again. I think if the penalty kill is dead last, there's going to be issues. So I think those are the kind of the things, right? Continue with the strengths, but the deficiencies can't be as obvious as they've been in past seasons.
All right, we've talked about, the known players, the name players. Give me a guy who isn't making headlines, but is making a big contribution to this good early season start for the Canucks.
Man, oh man, I kind of spoiled it early on, but Phil DiGiuseppe is really the guy that stood out to me. This guy was in the AHL basically for the past 2 seasons. And it's funny, in Vancouver, this guy was a preseason superhero and then got sent to the minors and then got injured. Like, he just kind of had things not go his way. And then, Taka comes in last year and he gets elevated to that top 6 with Miller and Boeser. And it kind of seemed like one of those things where all the Canucks had some injuries. They traded away some guys. He's just going to be filling in there temporarily. But this guy comes in, has another great preseason. Actually doesn't start in the top 6. I believe like Podkolzin and Höglander, 2, better known younger players got chances there. And Phil DiGiuseppe outplayed both of them. And I think the guy works his tail off. And we saw it in the Florida game last night. The Canucks have their backs up against the wall. They were down 3-1. Florida ties at 3-3. It was Phil DiGiuseppe who kind of held off 2 Panthers, centered the puck to Kuzmenko, who scores the game-winning goal. And it's just like, stuff like that is incredible. And DeSmith's also been great on the penalty kill too. It's just like, I kind of said on Locked On Canucks, this guy reminds me a little bit of Alex Burrows, just unheralded, but, works his tail off. And I think he's got to be the Canucks' unsung hero so far for sure.
All right, Trevor, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you and your co-host on social media?
Yeah, you can follow myself, Trev Beggs, on Twitter. My co-host, Kyle Bowen, that's BHAWAN. And then you can find Locked On Canucks on YouTube and wherever you listen to podcasts. Hey, the YouTube numbers for us they've been pretty strong out here. The ups are giving us some praise, but we could use some more audio listeners. But no matter where you listen to us, make sure you just look up Locked On Canucks wherever you listen to podcasts.
All right, Trevor, thank you so much. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, good as always, Gil. Hey, take care of Bo Horvat for us, eh? Or not.
All right, that's going to do it for this episode of the Locked On NHL podcast. I want to thank my guest, John Chik of Locked On New York Rangers, Laura Saba of Locked On Montreal Canadiens, and Trevor Beggs of Locked On Canucks. Don't forget now, I want to thank everyone for making Locked On NHL your first listen every day. Every dayers tomorrow on the show, and every Monday through Friday, we are here with the biggest stories from around the National Hockey League. So make sure you join us for that. Until then, have a great day, everybody. Stay safe, and thanks for listening to the Locked On NHL podcast.